Okay, again, so glad you're joining us tonight. This is the first of two offerings on our Christian faith and climate change. My name is Jim Keck, one of the ministers at First-Plymouth, and since 1866, our mission at First-Plymouth has been to increase the love of God and neighbor. And certainly, the love of neighbor would include taking care of our beloved earth, and love of neighbor would mean caring for our time neighbors, the next generations that will be living on this earth that we leave them. So welcome to this Increasing the Love session in that respect. This evening, I am honored to welcome Dr. Katharine Hayhoe as our speaker. Dr. Hayhoe is an atmospheric scientist who studies climate change, one of the most pressing issues facing humanity today. But she may be best known to many people because she's bridging that gap between scientists and Christians. Work she does in part because she's Christian herself. She's been named by Christianity Today as one of their 50 women to watch. She serves on the World Evangelical Alliance's climate ambassador and as the science advisor to the AROCA USA, the Evangelical Environmental Network, Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, and she currently hosts the PBS digital series, Global Weirding, Climate, Politics, and Religion. Dr. Hayhoe is the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy and a distinguished professor and chair at Texas Tech University. Now, we will have some moments at the end for questions. Dr. Hayhoe will help us see how to post our questions, but join me in a little wave of jazz hands and welcoming Dr. Katharine Hayhoe.
I love that. Thank you so much. It is so good to see all of your faces and all of your homes. It's really a treat to visit so many different people in their homes at one place. And hopefully this will be a conversation tonight. So it's really interesting what your purpose is and what you study, because the reason I'm a climate scientist is because I'm a Christian. It's when I learned that climate change affects the poorest and most marginalized people more than anyone. And to me, climate change is a failure to love. It's a failure to love God's creation, and it's a failure to love our sisters and our brothers, many of whom are already suffering the impacts of climate change today. And so when I talk about climate change, I often call it loving our global neighbor, because that's what climate action is. And as Christians, if we truly take what the Bible says seriously, I believe that we'd be out at the front of the lines demanding climate action. And you know what? Some already are. Across the whole United States, there are over 25,000 young evangelicals for climate action who are demanding climate action. There is the Catholic Climate Covenant, there is the Episcopal Statement, and there's the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Anglican Church, there's the Patriarch Bartholomew of the Orthodox Church, all kinds of Christian leaders, and of course, last but not least, Pope Francis. All kinds of Christian leaders are raising their voices, showing that Christian values are not incompatible with caring about climate change. In fact, quite the opposite. If we take our faith seriously, then again, we will be out at the front lines advocating for climate action, because it's a way to express our love for others. So I'm delighted to speak with you here tonight, and I'm going to be giving a talk for about 40 minutes, 40 minutes, and then I'm going to be taking your questions. Here's the fun part. It's something new, but hopefully you're game for it. I'm going to be taking your questions via something called Poll Everywhere. And it's not hard to figure out. In fact, the link is in the chat, and I am going to post the link again. So just a second here for those who joined late, I'm posting the link again. And if you click on that link, it will take you to a website. It's pollev.com, POLLEV.com/Katharine, my name. If you're typing it into your phone, you have to type it in spelling Katharine the right way, 2 A's. And actually, let me just share my screen with you so you can see it. There we go. pollev.com/Katharine. And on my phone, it looks like this. And here's the fun part. You can enter a question anytime at all. But you can also see the questions everybody else puts in, and you can upvote the questions you most want me to answer at the end, because I won't have time to answer everybody's questions. I'll probably only have time to answer half the questions. So if you see a question that you like, I want you to upvote it. And that way that I'll know to get to those questions at the end. Let's see. Did somebody have a question at the very beginning that they had their hand up? Oh, no, hand went down. Okay. If you have any problems, Lori and Maddie are in the chat. They will help you out. So if you have any questions and you can't figure anything out, just put it in the chat. But I'm going to go ahead and start the presentation now after I click to admit Ken. All right, so remember, anytime, questions here anytime, and you can see what other people have put. Okay, so climate change, why we care and what we can say about it. That was a great subtitle. I really like that because that's really the issue we have. We know it's real and most of us are worried. 70% of us in the United States are worried about climate change. 70%. But we don't know why it affects us or what we can say about it. Poor Ken is trying to get in again and again. I will admit him again. I think he must be having connection problems. Okay, so I'm going to start off in a little bit of a different way as a scientist, but I am a pastor's wife too. I'm going to start off with a verse from Genesis that often guides our perspectives on creation care. It's a verse where God is speaking and saying, let us make human beings in our image, make them reflecting our nature so that they can, and the Hebrew word is rada, every living thing that moves on the face of the earth. And rada is generally interpreted as having responsibility over, taking care of. And this is where the idea of stewardship comes from. The idea that if someone who we love and respect more than anyone in the world gives us a piece of property to care for, to look after, to rada, and we extract every penny of value from that property and we leave it a crumbling ruin, how have we fulfilled that responsibility? And what does that say about what we truly think about the person who gave it to us? Not much. Instead, if we are given a piece of property and we invest in it, we take care of it, the soil is healthy, it produces crops, it supports jobs and livelihoods for people, it provides shelter, not just for people, but for plants and for animals as well. Then we are truly having responsibility over, taking care of, caring for, stewarding the land that we've been given. So again, this is where the concept of creation care typically comes from. And we often think of creation care as caring for nature other than ourselves. But here's the interesting thing. I was, especially when I was younger, I was very big into manuscript studies where when you want to understand what a word or a verse or a phrase means, you look at where that same word or phrase is used other places in the Bible. And when we look at where the word rada is used other places in the Bible, and in Genesis 1, again, it specifically says to rada, every living thing on this planet, we go to Psalm 72, where it's speaking of God as a ruler, and it says, may he also rada from sea to sea, to what? To deliver the needy when he cries for help, the afflicted also, and him who has no helper, to have compassion on the poor and the needy, and the lives of the needy he will save. So what we have to realize is we're living things too. We are part of this. And what does that rada look like? It looks like caring for the poor and the needy and having compassion on those who have no helper. And when we look at what I study, climate change, when we look at climate change, we see that it affects all of us living things. It affects plants, it affects animals, it affects humans. It affects all of us in ways that matter to every single one of us, no matter where we live, and no matter what we're like, no matter what we care about, no matter what we do, no matter what we believe or don't believe, no matter what we vote or don't vote for, whoever we are already being affected by the impacts of a changing climate. It affects the amount of water that we have and the quality of that water. And we all need water. Climate change affects the air that we breathe, and we can't live without air to breathe. It affects the quality of the food that we eat and the quantity of it too, and we all need food. Climate change affects our infrastructure too. It affects our buildings and our roads. Oops, and my slides are stuck. It affects our buildings and our roads and our electricity systems and our water systems, all of which were built for conditions that no longer exist where we live. That's how fast climate is changing. It's changing faster than any time in the history of humans on this planet. When we look to the headlines, we see headlines like climate-fueled droughts in Madagascar, or Western heat waves that are 150 times more likely because of climate change. Just this past year, we've seen headlines about the horrific conditions in Afghanistan. Climate change did not create those conditions, but climate change is exacerbating them. Let me actually just read you a little bit of this here to show how. So parts of Afghanistan have warmed twice as much as the global average. Spring rains have declined in some of the country's most important farmland. Droughts are more frequent, including a punishing dry spell the second in 3 years. And then going down to the third paragraph. We can't attribute the conflict in Afghanistan to climate change. It already existed. But the effect of the warming acts as what the military calls a threat multiplier. It amplifies conflicts over water, puts people out of work in a nation where people largely live off agriculture. And as this professor of hydrology said, the war has even exacerbated climate change impacts. For the last 10 years, over 50% of the national budget goes to war. Now there's no government and the future's unclear. Our current situation today is completely hopeless. And climate change is making it worse. Wherever we look, there's reports of increasing extreme events because of climate change. It used to be back in the 1980s that we had $1 billion weather and climate disaster every 3 months on average, somewhere in the United States. About every 3 months, we would have one big disaster that caused at least $1 billion worth of damage. Do you know how frequently they're happening now? One every 18 days. Yes. And let me just give you the example from this week. This is just from this week. So a week ago, the headline was, California records the driest year in over a century. And then now the headline is, California rain breaks records. Climate change is loading the weather dice against us. Wherever we live, we always have a chance of naturally rolling a double six. There's always been droughts. There's always been storms. There's always been floods, wildfires, heat waves, hurricanes. But as the planet warms decade by decade, it's as if it's sneaking in and taking one of those numbers and replacing it with a 6 and another one. And pretty soon in Houston, Texas, they're like, we just had 3 500-year flood events in 3 years. How could that happen? It's climate change loading the dice against us. And then we roll a double 7 like the Western heat wave from this past summer. We say, there weren't supposed to be any 7s on the dice. That's climate change. So I was actually in Iowa when I was first asked this, but I'm switching it to Nebraska for obvious reasons. I was asked, how do you talk about polar bears in Nebraska? And I said, you don't. You talk about corn in Nebraska and how growing seasons are shifting, pests are moving northward, droughts are getting stronger, summer heat waves are more intense. You talk about drought and water shortages. You talk about flooding in between. We don't talk about what doesn't matter to us. We talk about what's happening where we live. It isn't about saving the planet itself. The planet itself will be orbiting the sun long after we are gone. It literally is about saving us. Because we, and many other living things with us, we living things cannot float around in outer space without this amazing planet that God gave to us as our home. What's at stake is human civilization as we know it, and many of the other living things that share this planet with us. So that's why this is kind of a radical statement. To care about climate change, we only have to be one thing: a human being living on planet Earth. Somebody said to me on social media today, they said, not enough people care about nature, so we'll never be able to fix climate change. I said, the good news is that we don't need everybody to care for the same reasons we do. If people care about nature, that gives them every reason to care. But what if they care about their children or grandchildren? What if they care about the safety of the place that they live? What if they are an avid, fisherman or birder? What if they have military experience? What if they're a business person? What if they enjoy beer or wine or food? What if they love going to beaches? Whoever we are, whatever we care about, wherever we live, we are already being affected by the impacts of a changing climate, to the point to where to care about climate change, we literally only have to be one thing, and that's a human living on planet Earth. So the good news is we don't have to convince people to care for the same reason we do. We just have to figure out what they already care about and then connect the dots to how climate change affects it. And in my book, I have so many examples of how you can start conversations by talking about if somebody cares about tennis, or they care about running, or they care about hockey, ice hockey, or they care about their health, or they care about the quality of the air they breathe, or they care about justice issues or poverty issues or issues of disease. Whatever we care about, we can begin the conversation with that and connect the dots to climate change. For me as a Christian, though, the biggest reason why I care about climate change, and in fact the reason why I am a climate scientist, is when I found out that the poorest 50% of people in the world, half the people on this planet, the poorest 50%, are responsible for 7% of our carbon emissions. 7%. Yet they are the ones who bear the brunt of the impacts. Women and children, especially in poor countries. Indigenous peoples who have already lost so much. Low-income neighborhoods, which are primarily brown or black neighborhoods here in the United States, they are the ones who are suffering the impacts of climate change first and foremost. Let me just give you one example with low-income neighborhoods in big cities. So in many big cities, these low-income neighborhoods were redlined over the last 100 years. Redlining is a racist practice of insurance companies and banks and mortgage companies where they wouldn't invest in those neighborhoods. And so many of those neighborhoods, people don't have yards, they don't have lawns, they don't have trees, they might have refineries or garbage dumps or hazardous waste sites even in their neighborhoods. And so when a heat wave comes along, those neighborhoods can be up to 15 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than wealthier neighborhoods in the same cities that have lots of green space and trees. When rains come, those neighborhoods are more likely to flood because they're located in flood zones where houses were more affordable. And if they do flood, they could flood a garbage dump and there could be all kinds of toxins in the water. When we look at the global scale, this is where people live in poverty. The darker the color, the more people live in poverty. Well, where are people most vulnerable to climate impacts? Pretty much the same places. The poorest people are the most vulnerable to climate impacts. Here, the darker the color, the more vulnerable people are. And this is no longer a future issue. It's already happening. Since the 1960s, climate change has already increased the gap between the richest and poorest countries in the world by 25%. Since the 1960s, this has already happened. And the United Nations warns that climate change threatens to undo the last 50 years of development, global health, and poverty reduction. This is already happening. So to me, it isn't just about what Genesis says. It isn't only about what the Bible says about caring for the smallest and seemingly most insignificant aspects of creation. To me, it is fundamentally an issue of love. And as Jesus says in the book of John, we Christians are supposed to be recognized by our love for other people. As Paul reminds us in Ephesians, we're supposed to walk in love, as Christ loved us sacrificially and gave himself up for us. How different would the world be if we truly loved each other and if we truly made decisions based on care and compassion for others? I'll tell you, we would have tackled climate change a long time ago if that was the case. So I want to address two questions now. And don't forget, you can ask me questions. So if you don't mind, Lori or Maddie, if you don't mind putting that link in the chat again for pollev.com, you can ask me your questions anytime. And I have one question here already. You can ask me a question anytime, and you can go and you can upvote the questions you most want answered. So click on that link in the chat. You can go to PolleV and you can type in your question or upvote a question that you want. But I'm going to keep on going. We're only about halfway done here. So people say, well, what can we do to fix climate change? What's going on here? Well, let me first of all explain why climate is changing. Back at the beginning of the industrial era, we figured out how to dig up massive amounts of coal and burn it to power our industrializing society. Since then, we figured out how to dig up coal or gas and natural gas and oil too and burn it. And when we burn fossil fuels, they produce heat-trapping gases that build up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket around the planet. That's why the planet is warming. 75% of those heat-trapping gases come from burning coal, gas, and oil. 25% come from land use change, deforestation, and animal agriculture. So what can we do about climate change? What does fixing climate change look like? It looks like three things. Number one, stop putting carbon into the atmosphere. Pretty simple, right? Number two, take carbon out of the atmosphere. And number three, build resilience to the changes that are already here today. Remember I said climate is changing faster than any time in the history of humans on this planet? We need to build resilience to the changes that are already here today and affecting us today, affecting the least of these. So what do these examples look like? Well, how do we stop putting carbon into the atmosphere? First of all, be less wasteful. We waste over 60% of the energy we produce. Most of it is waste heat. Efficiency could cut our carbon emissions in half. Just good old-fashioned efficiency. Okay, well then what's the other half? Clean energy. That's the other half. Wind, solar, geothermal, hydro, and more. All kinds of sources of energy that don't produce carbon, but they do produce energy. What types of solutions take carbon out of the atmosphere? It is a super high-tech solution called photosynthesis. Yes! When we grow things, they suck the carbon out of the atmosphere. We can grow things in forests, we can grow things in coastal wetlands, we can grow things in ecosystems, and we can grow things in our soil too. Did you know that regenerative agricultural practices, smart farming practices, are a huge part of the climate solution? Things like cover crops, where you grow cover crops, they soak up all the carbon from the atmosphere as they grow, and then you plow them back into the soil. They take that carbon into the soil with them, and carbon in the soil is a tremendous fertilizer. There's all kinds of ways that we can take carbon out of the atmosphere, and nature-based solutions, as they're called, are enough to account for 1/3 of all human emissions. That's pretty stunning. But some changes are already here today. And so for that reason, we have to build resilience. We have to conserve our water. We have to look for drought-tolerant crops. We have to protect ourselves against pests that are moving northward. And in our cities, we have to build resilience in those lower-income neighborhoods by greening them, planting trees, providing flood control, cleaning up the air quality, reducing the urban heat island effect. Planning for a future that is different than the one we experienced in the past. We can do this not only in North America, we can do this around the world. In India, millions of people do not have sanitation. And by sanitation, I mean they do not have somewhere to go to the bathroom where their waste can be disposed of safely. Sanitation is a nice name for that. And so human waste contaminates drinking supplies and contaminates the air and the soil. So there's a great organization called Sulab, and I talk about them in my book, where they have created flush toilets and they collect all the human waste. And you know what they do? They turn the human waste into biogas. So it's a win-win. Not only are they providing sanitation facilities, but they are also collecting the human waste and turning it into a renewable energy source. In Africa, they're using a smartphone app to improve rainwater harvesting. And in Africa, there's another amazing example of a man called Tony Renato from World Vision. Some of you might know World Vision. Some of you might be supporting a child from World Vision. World Vision is a relief and development organization that does a lot more than just adopt children. And one of the things they do is they have experts in agriculture and water. So Tony Renato is a World Vision agronomist from Australia. And he realized that one of the biggest problems in sub-Saharan Africa was that people can't grow food. They can't grow enough food to feed their families. They try, but they just can't always do it because of drought, because of changing rainfall patterns, high temperatures, and climate change making it worse. So he realized that if people planted trees along the sides of their fields and even between their crops, something called agroforestry, that those trees would trap water and would trap nutrients in the soil that would help the crops grow better. So he got 1 or 2 farmers on board with him, and it worked. And then they got a few more farmers on board, and it worked for them too. And now, 40 years later, thanks to Tony's program, they are growing enough more food in sub-Saharan Africa to feed 2.5 million more people because of the work that a single man did. And those crops are much more resilient to the impacts of a changing climate. They're more drought tolerant, they're more heat tolerant, they can provide food as climate changes. That's amazing. So as I mentioned, over 60% of the energy and over 40% of the food we produce is just wasted. Through being efficient alone, we could cut our carbon emissions in half and save money. That's a win-win. Converting the entire US power grid to 80% clean energy by 2030 is not only possible, but it would save $1.7 trillion in damages. That's amazing. What about jobs, people say? Don't we need jobs? Yes, we do need jobs because the coal industry has been in a free fall for 30 years. Did you know that clean energy already employs more people across the US than the fossil fuel industry? Did you know that when you build a solar farm, it creates 1.5 times more jobs than if you built a natural gas fired power plant? If we invest in efficiency programs like retrofitting buildings, that creates 3 times more jobs than burning more fossil fuels to power the buildings. And nature-based solutions, like I talked about, restoring and conserving ecosystems and smart agriculture, they create 4 times more jobs. It's a win-win-win. Oh, now my PowerPoint is stuck. And then people say, sure, but what about low-income countries? Don't they need fossil fuels too? Well, it turns out that one of the biggest reasons why they are low-income countries is because they don't have coal, gas, or oil. And so if we're saying, oh, you should use this too, we're actually saying you should buy it from us and we will sell it to you. They may not have a lot of coal or gas or oil, but they do have a lot of wind and sun, right? And so that's why last year, I'm talking about what already happened here. Last year, 90% of new energy installed around the world was clean energy. Isn't that amazing? The world truly is changing. So where do we start? Where do we start? We have to start by doing the one thing that most of us are not doing. And you might say, oh, okay, here she goes. She's going to talk about light bulbs and plug-in cars and, eating less meat. No, that's not what I'm going to talk about. The thing that we aren't doing is talking about it. And so that's why when I did a TED Talk a while back, 2.5 years ago now, I said the most important thing you can do to fight climate change is talk about it. Because we aren't talking about it. We don't talk about it because we don't understand how it matters to us. Sure, it matters to the polar bears and ice sheets and future generations, but we don't know how to communicate why it matters to others either. And we don't think there's anything positive that we can do to fix it. And if we don't think that, then why talk about it, right? So climate changes and we get worried. If we know anything about what's happening, we are worried. And we look around and we say, everybody else doesn't look worried enough. They need to be more worried. So what am I going to do? I'm going to gather up all of the scary facts I can muster. And believe me, there are a lot of scary facts on climate change, and they're all true. Most of them. I'm going to gather up all the scary facts and I'm just going to dump them on people. But remember what I said at the very beginning. And if you joined us late, no worries, I will repeat it. 70% of people in the United States are already worried about climate change. 70%. But what's the problem? We don't understand why it matters to us here and now, and we don't know what to do to fix it. So if you are already worried about something and somebody dumps more scary facts on you, you know what happens? Our human defense mechanisms kick in. Our psychological defense mechanisms, the ones all of us have as humans. We dissociate. We give up. We reject. Because there's nothing we can do. And so inaction results. And in my book, I quote from a neuroscientist named Tali Sharot, and this is what she says, not about climate change. She just says it about the way that our human brains work. Fear and anxiety will cause us to withdraw, to freeze, to give up rather than take action. And so what happens? Climate just changes more. This doesn't work. And you may have given it a try a few times and you might feel, yeah, it just didn't move the needle. So how do I talk to people about this? The first most common question I'm asked is, what gives you hope? And the second most common question I'm asked is, how do you talk about that? So that's why I wrote my book, to answer those two questions. What gives you hope and how do we talk about this? So how do we talk about it in a way that's productive? What would I do? How would I say that? We often think if I just tell people the facts, they'll change their minds, right? Well, here's the thing. We aren't just two groups when it comes to climate change. We're not just them and us. We're not just, people who say yes, it's true and people who say it isn't. We actually fall along a spectrum. And most of us are over here. Most of us are alarmed, concerned, or cautious, but we are not activated. We are worried, but we feel helpless and hopeless. That's most of us. Worried, but helpless and hopeless. Over here on the far end of the spectrum, we have dismissives. And you might know a dismissive. We all know at least one. They are very loud, and they are constantly saying that climate change is a hoax. And when I say that the most important thing that you can do is have a conversation about climate change, 9 times out of 10, when people hear me say that, they're like, oh yes, give me the formula, and I'm going to have a conversation with the dismissive person I know, and I'm going to sock it to them. I'm going to give it to them. They're going to change their minds finally. I have some sad news. They're not. They're called dismissives because they are so convinced that this can't be real, because if it is real, we have to fix it. And they don't think we can or should fix it because they don't think there's any solutions consistent with their political ideology. So they couch their objections in sciencey sounding objections, like it's just a natural cycle or a volcano, or they even couch it in religiously sounding objections, like God's in control, so why does it matter? When Genesis 1 says that God gave us responsibility over every living thing on this earth. But they wouldn't be convinced by 200 years of science. They wouldn't be convinced by 2,000 climate scientists. They wouldn't be convinced by 2 million scientific studies. My definition of a dismissive is if an angel from God with brand new tablets of stone appeared before them that said global warming is real in foot-high letters of flame, that would not change their minds. And if that wouldn't, why would I? I can't. But here's the good news. 92% of us, we are not dismissive. We're not. So what helps us? Not being a Don Quixote, not charging at the windmills of sciencey sounding objections or religiously sounding objections, but recognizing the real problems we have. The real problems we have are something called psychological distance and solution aversion. Let me translate those into English. We don't understand how it matters to us, and we don't know how we can fix it. Those are the two problems. So what do we need to talk about? Just flip that around. We need to talk about why and how it matters to us and all the positive things we can do to fix it. That's what we need to talk about. I have some proof for you. In case you doubt me, I have some proof that this really is our problem. Psychological distance is where we see a risk as being distant in time or space, being abstract rather than concrete, global average temperature rather than a heat wave in Nebraska, and we see it as being irrelevant to our primary concerns about polar bears rather than corn. So when you ask people across the whole United States, is global warming happening? Most people say yes. Anywhere that's orange here is more than 50% of people are saying yes. And as you can see, pretty much the whole US is orange. So people agree it's happening. And then you say, do you think it will harm plants and animals, non-human species, distant from us in relevance? People say yes. Will it harm future generations? You might think this is the same map. It isn't. It's just the same numbers. Will it harm future generations, people who are distant from us in time? Yes. Will it harm people in developing countries who are distant from us in space? Yes. How about our neighbors right here in the US? Mostly. We're getting a bit bluer here. And then they ask this question: do you think it will affect you? We don't think it affects us. So it doesn't matter whether we think it's real or not. If we don't think it affects us, why would we want to do anything to fix it? So that's why the biggest problem we have, number one, is we think it's a global problem. It doesn't matter to me. And when we talk about climate change, what we need to do is, instead of psychological distance, polar bears, glaciers, Antarctica, sea level rise, we need to talk about things that are close to us. Something that's happening now and here that is concrete, not global average temperature, and relevant to me. That's what we need to talk about. Again, why it matters to us and all the positive things that we can do to fix it. So in my book, I have all kinds of stories about how you can start conversations over gardening. You can start conversations over a shared faith. You can start conversations over the fact that you both enjoy golf or tennis or pickleball. You can start conversations with the fact that you both might be farmers, or you both might have shared military experience, or you just live in the same place and you see the same things happening. Whoever we are, we have points of connection with other people that we share, and those are the ways and the places to start the conversations, with something we share with people, not something that divides us. But it's equally important to talk about the second one, positive things we can do to fix it. Let me give you some examples. I love talking about what's happening in my state. I live in Texas, the home of the oil and gas industry. And if I can find things to talk about in my state, you can find things to talk about in your state too. We got 23% of our energy last year from wind energy. We're number one in the US. We have entire towns going green. We have entire airports going green. We have entire army bases going green. I love telling people what's happening here because they have no idea that Houston has a climate action plan and Dallas is powered by clean energy. They have no clue. And telling them helps them to realize that we're not alone. The giant boulder of climate action is not sitting at the bottom of the hill with only a few hands on it. It is up at the top of the hill, and it is rolling down the hill in the right direction, and it has millions of hands on it. We just need more. I love telling people what's happening with big companies. They're often surprised by that. Big companies are actually making huge strides forward. I definitely like talking about what's happening in faith communities. If you can put solar panels on a 1,000-year-old church in England, you can put it on any church, even ones in Nebraska or Texas. I love telling surprising stories, like, did you know the Kentucky Coal Museum went solar? Or did you know that United Airlines has been flying biofuel-powered flights out of the LA airport for 5 years? That's amazing, and most people don't know that. I love talking about what's happening around the world, how kids are winning science fairs for building an algae biofuel lab under their bed. Or how, again, like I said before, 90% of new energy installed around the world last year was clean energy. I love telling those stories, and I tell quite a few of those in my book too. So how do we have these conversations about climate change? Start with an inventory of who you are. Who you are is different than who anybody else is. My inventory is I am a scientist, so I love science, so I can talk to people about science. I'm Canadian, so I can talk to people about Canada. I live in Texas, so I can talk about what happens in Texas. I love skiing, which means I need snow. I'm a mom, which means I would do anything for a better future for my child. And I'm a Christian, so I believe that we are to be recognized by our love for others. And climate change affects the poorest and most marginalized among us. What's your inventory? Are you a gardener? Do you love bees? Do you love visiting the beach? Do you like walking your pet? Do you have grandchildren that you're passionate about? Whoever you are, you have something about you that you can begin a conversation with somebody else about, and then talk about how climate change affects our kids or our grandchildren's future. about how climate change affects our crop yields and our economy, about how as a Christian there's so many points of connection. Begin the conversation with something we have in common, connect to how climate change affects it, and always, always, always bring in a positive, constructive solution. It could be something you do yourself. I'm reducing my food waste. It could be something your church is doing. We did an energy audit to reduce our energy use, and look how much money we saved. We could actually put that away towards solar panels in a couple of years. You could talk about what your city's doing, what your state is doing, what other businesses are doing, what farmers are doing. Talk about real solutions that people can get on board with, be amazed and surprised by. So remember this, climate changes and we get worried. But what do? You don't load up on all the fear-based facts. You load up on and you prepare with information on how climate change is affecting you here, now, in ways that are relevant and concrete, and a positive solution that you can engage in yourself, or you could together as a group, as a Rotary Club, as a Lions Club, as a church congregation, as a neighborhood, as a social group. People feel empowered and action results. And you know what? That's because that's the way our brain is wired. To go back to what Tali Sharot, the neuroscientist, says, she says, our human brain is built to associate forward action with a reward, not avoiding harm. So reframe your message so the information you produce induces hope, not dread. Isn't that beautiful? Hope, not dread. So where does our hope come from? And I know that we have questions, and I know that the top question is what gives you hope? So I'm going to cheat a little bit and answer that top question right now. But I want you to go to Poll EV, enter your questions, upvote the ones you want me to answer, and I will get to those next because we still have 17 minutes together. So what gives us hope? Well, I'll tell you what doesn't give us hope is when we have no sense of agency, when we feel like anything we do will make no difference. That's what discourages us, depresses us, paralyzes us. So often we view climate action as a giant boulder sitting at the bottom of a steep hill with only a few hands trying to push it up the hill, and it's not budging an inch. And if I add my hand to that boulder, it won't make any difference, so why bother? That's the way we picture climate action, and that is what gives us no hope. So what gives us hope? Action. To use Greta Thunberg's words, and you know her, she's that little girl with the pigtails who talks about climate change. She says, the one thing we need more than hope is action, but when we act, hope is all around us. And when we look around, we realize that the giant boulder of climate action is already at the top of the hill, and it is rolling down the hill in the right direction. It already has millions of hands on it. I just couldn't find a picture with millions of hands. So you have to picture those millions of hands. There are millions of hands on that boulder, and when you add your hand, it will go a tiny bit faster. And when we add our hands as a congregation, it will go even faster. What gives us hope is something that social scientists call efficacy. The idea that if we do something, can it make a difference? And the answer with climate action is it can. In the words of the scientists, this is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change speaking here, every year counts, every action counts, every choice matters. Everything we do truly does move that boulder just a little bit faster in the right direction, and that is what gives us hope. When we look around and we see all the hands on it, when we share stories of the other hands that are on it with people who weren't aware, when we add our own hand to the boulder, that's where we find hope. Like I said, it's science. The science says that every action matters, every bit of warming matters, every year matters, every choice matters. We have an opportunity to participate. And we know that the outcome is not up to us. We are simply called to walk in the good works that have been prepared for us in advance. We can't control other people. We can't control their choices. We can't control their response to us. We are just called to be faithful to our responsibility to do what we can with the abilities and the opportunities we've been given, and to trust that, yes, every single one of us can make a difference. One of my colleagues, her name is Katharine Wilkinson. As you can see, she spells her name the right way, 2 A's. She said something which was so striking, I wanted to share it with you. She said, in a book that she helped to write called All We Can Save, she said, "It is a magnificent time to be alive, at a moment that matters so much. This is a time when they will be writing in the history books, but it's up to us if there will be history books. All of us, every single one of us can make a difference up until the day that we die. We all can put our hand on that boulder, and we can encourage others to put their hand on that boulder too." So I want to close with this thought, and this is something that I wrote that is not in the book. This is in an essay I wrote for Time magazine just a couple of weeks ago. People were saying to me after the book came out, they were saying, "Yeah, but talking, just talking, that isn't enough. We need action." I said, well, first of all, talking is an action, number one. Second of all, how would you ever act without talking about it first? Even when you act, that is a form of expressing yourself to others if they see you. Talking is a catalyst. It's like knocking over the first domino. And so I started to look back through history. And as I looked back through the history of our industrialized society, I realized an amazing thing that I wanted to share with you. And that is that when significant societal change has happened in the past, it happened because people used their voices to advocate for change at every level. And let me read this to you so you see what I mean. Change did not begin with the King of England deciding to end slavery, or the President of the United States giving women the vote, or the National Party of South Africa opting to end apartheid. It began when ordinary people of no particular power or wealth or fame, decided that the world could and should be different. Who were William Wilberforce, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, and all the countless others whose names we don't know, who shared and supported and fought for their visions of a better world? They were people who had the courage of their convictions, who used their voices to advocate for the systemic societal changes needed. We are the people who changed the world before, and we ordinary people, we are the ones who can change it again. And how does it all start? It all starts with using our voice, because what's at stake here again is not the planet itself, it's us. And together, I think we truly can save us. Thank you. All right. Thank you, everybody, for your comments. And I noticed, too, if you look in the chat, there's still a few copies of the book left in the church office, right? So you can swing by and get one for $20, which is quite nice. Oh, I see a few people already have them. And you can also get an audio version that I read myself. And you can get there we go. Yep. A few copies already. You can get an ebook version, too. And in that book, it answers those two questions. What gives you hope, and how do I talk about it? With all kinds of different examples. So we have a ton of great questions now. Lots of great questions. You've been really busy upvoting these questions. Okay, so let's go with the top question, 11 votes. How do we convince and encourage our state politicians who keep putting off a climate action plan for the state to move forward with one? Well, this may surprise you, but politicians are humans too. A special type of human, granted, but they still have the same human brain we have. So remember, what's the biggest problem we have? It's not lack of facts. It's that we don't understand how it matters, and we don't understand what to do to fix it. So when we talk with a politician, it's really important, and when I say really, it's even more important than with the average person, to emphasize what is happening in Nebraska. And believe me, your universities have already been studying this, and they have a lot of good stuff out there on what's happening in Nebraska, how much it's costing us, how it's impacting farmers and cities and infrastructure and things that matter to Nebraska. So look up, do your homework and your research on what's happening in Nebraska. But then here's the important thing. You need examples of solutions that are good for Nebraska, solutions that grow jobs, solutions that create a stable power grid, solutions that help farmers put carbon back in the soil and become more flood resistant. So look at what people are proposing, because there's a lot of smart people who are proposing great solutions, solutions that are bipartisan, that invest in nature or agriculture or jobs or young people or city or infrastructures. Find some solutions that really work and suggest them. The politician might not go for those, but when they realize that there are solutions that even as a Republican they can get on board with, there are absolutely solutions Republicans can get on board with. That's where we truly can make a difference. Because again, if we understand why it matters and what we can do to fix it, that's how we can move forward. And honestly, it is easier to move forward at the state level and at the city level. Don't neglect your city. Than it is at the federal level, and then often the federal level follows. So great question. How are we going to cope with the idea of a continually growing economy? Well, here's the challenge. We have to fix climate change now. A lot of people, not so often now, but in the past, they've said, okay, let's fix this problem first, and then we can fix climate change. Let's fix materialism. Let's fix waste. Let's fix, let's invest in a circular economy and degrowth, and then we can fix climate change. If it were 1980, I'd say sure, but it isn't. It's 2021, and the window's closing fast. We got to fix this thing with what we've got, and you know what? As we fix it, it will fix other problems. Like what? Like the fact that we waste 40% of our food and 60% of our energy. Like the fact that we just spend all kinds of money on things that we don't need, that have a huge carbon footprint, but we're not actually paying the price for them. So as we fix climate change, we'll be investing in clean air, clean water, smart agriculture, healthier food, more walkable cities, flood control, nature-based solutions. Oh, and taking up carbon too. But we can't afford to wait. We have to do it with the flawed and imperfect systems we have these days. And so that's why solutions like a price on carbon are so important, because they work with our current economic system. They say, fine, you're going to use an economic system. Well, let's just stick a price on carbon. And then if somebody still wants to drive a gas guzzler, they can, but they have to pay the price. That's fair. So we have to be realistic. We can't be idealistic about this. We have to be clear-eyed. But we have to realize that there are solutions that benefit us all. All right. What do I think about nuclear power? That is always a hot button issue where people fall into, I like that, yes. Juan Carlos is commenting here. Let's start with our neighborhoods and realistic, not idealistic. I love that. Nuclear power is one of those issues that always falls into black and white, yes or no. But the main reason why we don't have more nuclear power today? Cost. That's it, just cost. They tried to build one nuclear power plant in the whole U.S. the last 30 years in South Carolina. It got so out of control price-wise that after they spent $9 billion and all they had to show for it was a hole in the ground, they just filled the hole back in and canceled the project. So nuclear is not going to save us. Even if nuclear were dirt cheap, it would only take care of the power sector, and the power sector is only a quarter of the problem. So does that mean there's no role at all for nuclear? No, for two reasons. First of all, the Idaho National Labs is developing a very new type of modular nuclear reactors that are tiny. They're not big. So they have the potential to be a lot cheaper, and they're actually building a demonstration plant in Utah right now. So they could potentially provide backup power at a much more reasonable cost because they're tiny and they're scalable as opposed to giant and big. And then, of course, there's research going on in China and France on nuclear fusion, which produces no waste. Nuclear fusion produces no waste at all. But there's sort of an ongoing joke, which is very true, that nuclear fusion is always 30 years away. It's always 30 years away. So eventually, we'll be able to get electricity from nuclear fusion. But honestly, I think it's going to be my grandchildren by the time that happens. So sure, I think there is a role in some places, in some ways, for nuclear, but it is not going to save us like some people paint it to be. We need everything on the table. And for everything, there's this great resource called Project Drawdown. And I'm going to put a link in the chat. If you don't know about Project Drawdown, I encourage you to check it out. It's just drawdown.org. I'm going to put the link right here. And they list 100 different solutions to climate change. So they have solar panels and efficiency, sure, and they have nuclear, but they also have conservation agriculture, preserving coastal wetlands, educating women and girls in poor countries. They have amazing solutions, and they will give you tons of things to talk about. If you feel like, I don't know what to talk about, go to Drawdown or read the book, and it will give you all kinds of things that you can bring up in conversation. Say, did you know? I learned this. Isn't that amazing? People love interesting facts that are hopeful and positive, and so look for those and share them. Okay, how do you find out about all the good things that are going on in our community? Well, we live in a very different world today than we did, 20 years ago, where everything's online. So I actually look online. I Google Climate Action Nebraska, and I Google Clean Energy Nebraska, and I Google Regenerative Agriculture Nebraska, and I read the news stories that come up. And I even put in Google News alerts so that they email me whenever there's a new story with those things in it. Except I don't do Nebraska, I do Texas, but you get the point. But then also, you know what I do when I hear those stories? I share them. I post them on social media. I talk about them with other people. I share them and I learn from other people. And so then other people start sharing things with me too. So that's a way that we can be truly contagious, by sharing that good news with people and by helping people see that, yeah, that boulder is already at the top of the hill. It's rolling in the right direction. It has millions of hands on it, but it just needs more. We have to get it going faster, and every single one of us can contribute by adding our hand through something we're doing ourselves, personally in our lives, or through something we're doing with our church or congregation or our neighborhood or our block or our children's school or our grandchildren's school, or by just talking about what's happening and what other people are doing and inspiring people to act and change that way. So let me close with this question, because there's a lot of questions here that are being specific. Like, how do I talk to these people? How do I talk to those people? How do I talk about this topic? And I'm going to answer all of those in a general way, and then I'll close with one specific question. If you are asking, how do I talk to fill in the blank? What do? You begin with what? What matters to them? And if you don't know what matters to them, ask. Begin with what matters to them, connect the dots to how climate change is affecting it, and bring in a positive, constructive solution that they can get on board with. This works for farmers. It works for people concerned about natural climate solutions. It works for politicians. It works for parents. It works for our neighbors and our friends. It works for people where we work. It's the same model, but you have to begin with something that they care about. That's the key. Okay, so last question. I study climate change, as I do too. So I tend to use facts in these brief conversations. What's a way to use values instead? Ask questions of the other person linked to current weather. What would you suggest? I would start, you can start with an interesting fact, but it's something that's interesting to them. So instead of, did you know that sea level is rising twice as fast as when the satellite record began 25 years ago? That is a fact that is interesting to you and me, but it is not interesting or relevant to somebody who lives in Nebraska because you are not on the coast, and also it's a scary fact. So instead, I like to begin a conversation with, hey, did you know that last year we got X% of our energy from wind energy? Huh, that's interesting. Or, you could compare yourselves with Iowa. You could be like, Iowa gets this much wind energy, but here in Nebraska, we're lagging behind. Did you know that we should catch up, don't you think? Or you can talk about a weather. In the book, I talk about how you could begin a conversation with weather. And I ask people what weather they've experienced themselves. And then sometimes I ask them, do you feel like things are getting weirder? And today everybody says, yes, I do think things are getting weirder. And I'm like, yeah, I do too. And I said, do you know that's because of a warmer planet? That's why it's happening, but it affects us here. Isn't that crazy? And so then we can talk about, well, what can we do about it? So Katharine put a great link in the chat. She said, check out the Action for Climate Emergency, and works with youth across the country. There's also lots of great programs that work with youth, like the Climate Initiative and climategeneration.org. There's all kinds of great programs, and I like to join organizations like Interfaith Power and Light. Sign up for their newsletters, or if you're on social media, follow them on social media. And I also, I'm part of Evangelicals for Climate Action. There's the Catholic Climate Covenant. There's all kinds of faith-based conservation organizations. I follow them, I get their information, and then I share it. So I'm just going to do a little dump here in our last, we're already at time. I'm just going to do a quick little dump here of Interfaith Power and Light. if you're interested, I'll put their website up here. So here. That's one organization that you can sign up for, and you can get their resources, and they have chapters by state, and it gives you something to talk with about people. And I love that people are putting other organizations in here. That's great. So do your research, find out things that you can talk about with people, and share, because every time we have a conversation, we are pushing that boulder just a tiny little bit faster. Thank you so much for having me. This has been wonderful. Please check out the book and have conversations with people about this. Share what you've learned, share why it matters. And if there's any particularly good story, you can always email me through my website and tell me how it went. Thank you.
Dr. Hayhoe, thank you so much. Yeah, wave your hands to Dr. Hayhoe. And just before you log off, just a couple of announcements. Please know we have copies of her book, Saving Us, at the First-Plymouth office. And you can come by and get one for $20. And if you'd like to continue this great conversation she has helped to begin, know that Reverend Penny Greer will be holding a 3-week class centered on her book, Saving Us, and the class begins November 7th. So details are on the First-Plymouth website. Check that out. Also then, please know that next week is the second talk in this series. Dr. Don Wilhite, UNL Professor Emeritus of Applied Climate Science, will present Climate Change Science, Code Red for Humanity. He'll discuss what climate scientists have learned in the last year and what it means for our future, review some climate change science basics, and then talk briefly about solutions as well. I want to also say a shout out to Lori Benson and the climate action team at First-Plymouth for providing these wonderful, these aren't just learning opportunities, as Dr. Hayhoe has been emphasizing. This is a chance to change consciousness and to change our world. And so wonderful time tonight. Again, God bless you all, and God bless our world. Good night.